So I'm just going to read a few sentences here. The purpose of this archive is to document information on Utah's nuclear history and to focus on individuals, families, and areas impacted by nuclear testing. Today we would like to hear the story of how you and your family were impacted by nuclear weapons testing and your memories about tests conducted at the Nevada test site. This is Anthony Sams, and I'm with the J. Willard Marriott Library here at the Marriott Library's video studio in Salt Lake City, Utah. Today's date is the 18th of December, and we will be recording an interview with
Kevin Crawford.
Kevin Crawford for the Downwinders of Utah Archive. We're just going to go over some essential things, and then we'll just kind of have a conversation.
Okay.
Could you just give me your full name, and could you spell it?
Kevin Charles Crawford, first name Kevan, Charles Charles, Crawford, Crawford.
Great, thanks. And so, just off the top, what is your connection to Downwinders and nuclear testing conducted at the Nevada test site?
Well, I have a lot of connections. Start personally. I'm a nuclear engineer. Graduated in chemical engineering in 1978, and have a degree in mechanical engineering out of the Nuclear Engineering Laboratory, master's in 1983, and that was a master's, by the way, in nuclear engineering out of the mechanical engineering department. My PhD was 1986. It's in mechanical engineering out of the mechanical engineering department, but the research topic was digital control of nuclear reactors. So I had been operating the reactor there as director of reactor operations since I think it was 1981. October 1981 was when Craig Jensen stepped down. I took the position, paid position, and ran the reactor there for until 1986, at which point that's where I got my PhD. I went to Texas A&M, ran the Nuclear Science Center. I was director of reactor operations at the Texas A&M Nuclear Science Center from 86 to 88, when I got a call from the U of U and said, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has shut us down. Would you please come back and help us open it up? So I left A&M, came back up here, and got the facility reopened, got the documentation all squared away, and then got a bunch of research projects running so that it could be self-funding. And then in 1991, I left here and went to Idaho State University, where although the agreement was I would not have anything to do with the reactor, the first thing they did was dump the reactor responsibilities off on me. It's a smaller reactor up there. And I was director of reactor operations up at Idaho State until January 1994, at which point I was awarded a Fulbright grant, and I had to start going into language training immediately. The grant was to Belarus, which, interesting enough, is directly downwind of Chernobyl in Ukraine. So I went, I did my language training, and I went to Belarus and was there for 1 full year. And I worked as a visiting professor at the Belarusian Technical University. And I taught not only engineering, law, and project management, which was what I was contracted to do, but they brought me on to teach core physics, core design, and radiation protection. Because there was a very serious problem over there. It actually took out a quarter of their arable land, and they had to sit fallow while the isotopes decayed. I left there, came back here, and I'm now running my consulting company, which we are looking at building a reactor, a fairly large non-power reactor here in the Salt Lake Valley to produce medical isotopes for heart and brain imaging primarily, but a lot of other things. Basically, medical isotope reactor. That's what I'm doing right now.
Great. So tell me a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up? And just sort of background.
Grew up here in Salt Lake Valley. I grew up at the mouth of Mill Creek Canyon. And I remember as a kid, and this is in the 50s, Bob Pendleton from up here in the radiobiology department coming out. He's taking samples, environmental samples, up in the Mount Olympus Cove area, which is right next door to where I live. And he did that during the atmospheric testing. Forgot to mention, I provided technical assistance with Gary Sandquist to the Community Air Monitoring Network system around the Nevada test site from, I think it was right around 1981 until I left here in 1991. The project was closed in 1993 when underground testing was stopped. Did the same up at Hanford Reservation too, by the way. We went up and got their network all trained and operating in 1990, 1991.
And the Hanford is in Idaho, just...
Hanford is in Washington. It's in the Tri-City area. That's Richland, Kirtland, and Pasco, Washington. It's in the southeast corner of the state of Washington, right along the Snake River, or the Columbia. It's down there. It's the Columbia River.
And so what year were you born?
1956.
56, okay. And you were in Utah that whole time from 56 to 62 range?
Yes.
Okay.
63 was when the atmospheric testing was stopped.
Right. But they continued underground through.
Right.
Describe yourself and your family during this era. So talk about where your parents came from, kind of what they did.
My dad was from Southern California. He was born in San Diego, raised in Indio, where my grandfather homesteaded a ranch. Out in Indio is next door to Palm Springs, so you can kind of get a feeling of hot desert, date palms. What else do they produce around there? Golf courses. It wasn't golf courses back in the 1920s, but lots of date farms and farming out in that area. He moved, he got involved as a kid, roughly 20 years old, mining gold in the hills above Indio. A company came in there and started working the Thousand Palms Canyon area. And my dad was trained on the use of dynamite. So he became a powder monkey, which is an explosive expert's assistant. So he kind of was doing all the running for the explosive experts. And with that training and having been on the farm, he got a job with W.W. Clyde on Hoover Dam. And that was roughly about when he was 30. So I guess that would have been, no, he must have been younger. He must have been about 25. He was born in 1912, so you can kind of get an idea of when that was going on. When W.W. Clyde got the contract to build Geneva Steel, then my dad was transferred from Southern California to Provo, Utah. And it was his introduction to Utah. And from Provo, then he was inducted into the Army in, I think it was, he was married in November 1942, and I think he went into the Army shortly thereafter.
What was your father's name?
Paul G. Crawford.
Paul Crawford, okay.
Gibson, Paul Gibson Crawford, another family name.
And then talk a little bit about your mother.
My mom is a first-generation immigrant. Her parents were born in Norway, and actually her oldest brother, was born in Norway also, and that's Bergen, Norway, on the west coast. They immigrated here about 1903, my grandparents and my oldest uncle, and they were relocated in Ephraim, Utah, Sanpete County. And she was born in 1922, and as her description was, it wasn't but about 2 or 3 months after that, or about the first of the year 1923, they moved to Provo, Utah, because construction work. My grandfather was a construction contractor in Provo. The business was booming in Provo, so he had more work. And she married my dad in November 1942. And from there, she was between Southern California and Salt Lake City all the time until my dad came home. He was released from Fort Douglas in 1945, Thanksgiving 1945. I guess they spent the holidays here, and then first of the year, 1946, they moved to Blythe, California. Now, they were in Blythe for a year or two, and then they moved to Salt Lake. And they took up residence on Lincoln Street. And they were there from, I guess, roughly 1947 to about 1952. And then they had the house built starting 1954 in the Skyline High School area, which is mouth of Mill Creek Canyon. They moved in May 1955, and that's been my mom's home until I put her in a care center a couple of months ago.
And we interviewed your mom, but could you just state your mom's name?
My mom's name is Norma Irene Crawford.
Great, thank you.
Her maiden name is Christiansen.
Christiansen.
And it was Christiansen Construction in Provo that my grandfather started and worked.
Nice. Talked about that, your parents. So do you have any siblings?
I have an older sister, Judy, born 1946, an older brother, Robin, born 1953, and a younger brother, Timothy, born 1960. Judy was born in Blythe. The rest of us boys were born in Salt Lake.
And do they all live in the...
Judy's in a care center here. Robin is he lives in a condo by Cottonwood High School. Tim lives in Olympia, Washington, and is a print shop manager.
What are some of your memories of the era around nuclear weapons testing? So
Do you want nuclear weapons related or?
well, just sort of your memories of growing up and
Memories of growing up. Okay, nothing related to nuclear other than Bob Pendleton collecting samples in Olympus Cove. The memories, I remember walking in the fields with, as a 4-year-old or earlier, with Dave Dutson, my friend, who lived just up the street, actually right across the street from Skyline High School. We used to walk that area. It was all owned by the Stillmans. They were a pioneer family. And Skyline was nothing but just a horse pasture. There were 2 horses, a white one and a black one, that used to roam around out there. And there was a pig farm along the creek, Mill Creek. And we used to go over there with the horses and the pigs and just do what kids do, just hang out, throw dirt clods at the pigs, get run off by the farmer, that kind of stuff. So Skyline they started construction in 1962. It was opened in 1963. I guess it was opened, actually, it was opened fall of 1962. So it had to have been, they had to have started construction either 1960 or 61. The first year, June of 1963, there was not a graduating class. My sister graduated the first graduating year, 1964. Back in those days, there was no freeway. The traffic on Wasatch Boulevard stopping at 3860 South, which is Mill Creek Canyon Road, was horrible. I remember the traffic backing up there at that stoplight for a couple of miles on Wasatch Boulevard, everyone coming into town. So that area was just this side of the initial farms that were put out there in pioneer times in the 1800s. And as the Stillmans were the original owners there, they still had a home, and it was located right now where I-215 is. So they had to move or tear down the home. I don't know what it was, if they moved it or tore it down, but that's where the Stillmans lived. I remember the Thanes lived up where Mill Creek Canyon Road goes under 215 right now. Their home was right there where the underpass is. And then Dave Dutson, as I mentioned, he lived just the first house down on Mill Creek Canyon Road from 215.
kind of hard to imagine that area.
At that time,
Yeah.
Exactly. When we moved there, and we have 8mm film of this, looking out out west from the front porch of the house, and there were no houses. It was just this yellowish grain, of course, after the midsummer. No houses. Wasatch Junior High was built first, and that was the property for Wasatch. The property that it was put on was fairly large, and it has since been cut down and subdivided for homes. Guess they think kids don't need the outdoors anymore.
Yeah, right. Let's see. Do you remember any nuclear tests being conducted?
No, not personally. As a kid, we did things like we played Army. out in the fields, in the weeds. We built a baseball diamond where there are currently now houses at the end of the street where my parents owned the home. And we chased wild animals, squirrels. There were cats in the area, but we were allowed to sleep outside. Now figure that, I don't know, I guess we were tough. But we've had cats killed right up the street, not about 5 to 8 years ago. There was a mountain lion killed at the mouth of Mill Creek Canyon. And we've had deer in the yard about 10 years ago. I discovered deer droppings out in the backyard after the winter. And I'm going, we never had deer when we were here as kids sleeping out in the backyard. We never had cats, we didn't have anything, but they're there now.
Yeah, being kind of pushed around by people,
I guess.
So.
Well, when people first move in, of course, they back off. But as they start to become familiar with suburbs, they start to move back in, then you begin to see them. We had, about 15 years ago, a raccoon on the top of the house. Now, I know they've always had raccoon problems along Mill Creek.
Yeah.
The dentist my mom worked for lived right on the creek, and he had a little garden down there. He said the raccoons would go and raid it every year.
Oh. Do you recall what individuals thought
Of
nuclear testing?
We as kids, we were kind of kept away from that. We were kept away from the missile crisis. I don't remember anything about the missile crisis other than what's been on TV ever since. National politics, I do remember when Kennedy was assassinated. I remember the feeling, I remember the feeling in the schools because I was at Eastwood Elementary. I remember listening to the funeral on the radio. I remember seeing Kennedy on the TV as a kid. But as far as nuclear testing goes, no, we were pretty much kept away from that. It wasn't until Bob Hacker died that we had any kind of indication at that point, other than Bob Pendleton collecting environmental samples, that there was any problem.
Talk in the community that you lived in growing up about, nuclear testing going on, or even like the, below ground testing
as mentioned, yeah, from 63 to 93.
Mm-hmm.
No, and I guess the parents kept that stuff away from us so that we wouldn't have anxieties. Whether that was a good thing or not, I don't know. But that's what happened. I do remember the civil defense shelters. And did we do duck and cover in the schools? I don't specifically remember, but if it was anything, it would have been at Eastwood Elementary. After Eastwood, I went to Upland Terrace, which opened up, I'm guessing, well, it was when I was in third grade, so 3-6 when I was 9, that would have been 1965, Upland Terrace opened. And I know we didn't do it there. I remember, but we might have done it at Eastwood Elementary.
Duck and cover.
Duck and cover, right. And I do remember the civil defense shelters in Wasatch Junior, because we got into them without any adult supervision, but we got into them. We didn't do anything to them, but we knew they were there. We knew what they were for.
How are your let's talk about like the effect of nuclear testing. So how are you or your family personally affected? Just the personal connection.
All right, to the testing.
Yeah.
And I'm going to talk about the atmospheric testing and not the underground testing because I was more personally involved with the underground testing. But the atmospheric testing, my dad, when he came up to build Geneva Steel, he met a man named Bob Hacker. Bob Hacker was working in the control tower at the Salt Lake Municipal Airport, which at that time, you probably don't remember, but it's east on the other side of the runways from the current international airport. And relatively small. They use it now for National Guard, Air National Guard. But I remember going to the municipal airport and seeing the DC-3s pulling in with the Western Airlines emblem on the nose of those DC-3s, which at that time, you probably don't remember. I discussed this last night with Joyce. But it was an Indian with swept back hair and tail feathers, as if he was going through the air. But it was on the front of the nose, a round Indian with a headdress and the swept back wind-blown hair. But Bob worked in the control tower there at the airport, where he met in close proximity to where my dad was in Provo. I guess my dad must have come up here. I don't know the circumstances of how they met, but they became close and fast friends, tight friends, and I can explain, just how tight in just a minute. But Bob was here in 1940. He's in the census. If you looked at his record, he's in the census. And working the control tower with somebody from Montana. They lived at an apartment at the mouth of Memorial Grove. Spencer Court, I think, was the name of the street that he lived on. And anyway, they met in 1943, October 1943. Bob was inducted into the Army Air Corps at Wendover Field. And he was his MOS was 1035, which is a bombardier. Interesting enough, he was inducted on the same day at the same place as my cousin, Frank Denstad. Frank was his MOS was a 1032. He was a pilot, and the group that they were inducted into was the 461st Bombardment Squadron of the 766th Bombardment Group of the Army Air Corps, 15th Air Force. They got their training in B-24 heavy bombers, and he was stationed, both of them were stationed at Toretto Air Base in Italy. And they flew missions out to Yugoslavia. I think they were involved in the Romanian Romanian oil field bombardment. And some of those B-24s came from North Africa, but they came from Italy after Italy was captured and turned into a launching place for the U.S. Army to go into Europe, the main part of Europe. Just a little side note, and I have to mention this, is Frank Denstad, as a pilot in a B-24, he had a mission over France in 1944. He was shot down and killed. And Bob was there on that mission at the same time. So when they came back from the war, and I'm going to say 1946, I'm not sure if they were released in 1945 or not. I would have to get Bob's military record and see exactly when he was released. But when Bob came back, my mom directed him to Frank's mother so he could have a word with her about Frank's last mission. He was buried in France, and he was reinterred in 1948 in the Salt Lake City Cemetery. Anyway, when my dad came back, my parents moved to Blythe, California, where my dad was a gas station attendant. That's what he did after the war. And Bob went back to the CAA, which is the forerunner to the FAA. That's the Civilian Aeronautics Administration. And Bob was stationed first in Yuma, Arizona, where he was director of airport operations there. And that's where Bob's son was born, so I'm assuming Bob must have been married between 1946 and 1948. His wife's name was Martha, and I don't know her maiden name, and I don't even know where they were married, but I assume it was in Arizona. And Blythe and Yuma are about 50 miles apart, so they had this pre-war association, and they got to continue that after the war, so they became really tight friends. And interesting enough, and I'm going to mention this, is they were so tight that Bob, when he had his son Stephen in 1949, gave him a middle name of my dad's name, Paul. So it's Stephen Paul Hacker. And that's how tight they were. Then in about 1947, 48, somewhere in there, my parents moved from Blythe to Salt Lake because my mother couldn't stand the desert insects. And of course, along the Colorado River there, not only do you get the heat, but you get the humidity, and the insects go wild. So at any rate, so they moved to Salt Lake. I won't give you all the details of that, but they packed everyone in the car, and my sister, and all the furniture they had. And they came to Salt Lake, and they moved on Lincoln Street. They initially lived in my mom's aunt's house, which was somewhere in the area, Wilmington Avenue, rings a bell. Margaret, and I can't remember her name. Well, it must have been Denstedt. So they moved there, and they kept in touch with Bob. Bob was transferred from Yuma Airport Operations to Cedar City Airport Operations in 1950. And Bob was Director of Airport Operations from 1950 to 1956. Now, I've called Cedar City Municipal Operations, and I was directed to the Director of Public Works for Cedar City to get Bob's record. And Bob was put on the Public Service Board in Cedar City from 1950 to 1956. So that's how I got the dates exactly, as I confirmed it with municipal records. Then they directed me to the Utah Digital Newspaper website, where I pulled out newspaper articles on Bob. And he was very much involved in the Kiwanis Club. He started a Cub Scout pack down there in Cedar City. And his wife was very active in the Kiwanis. And so they were active in the community. Bob was a member of the Public Utilities Board. He was Director of Airport Operations. I tried calling the current Director of Airport Operations in Cedar City. He didn't return my call, so I couldn't talk to him about it. But during that time, my parents here would go down to Cedar City all the time. And Steve Hacker and Judy, my sister, used to play together all the time. Bob would tell them to go out into the desert and find stuff, just general, get out of the house, go do something. So they used to go out and play in the desert, I guess, during that period. And so you can figure sometime between 1950 and 1956, the kids were out there playing in the dirt. Bob, as Director of Airport Operations, and we talked about this briefly, was required to work on runway maintenance, maintaining the lights, maintaining the surface, and maintaining the antenna for aircraft communications, because Bob was Director of all airport operations, but his specialty was radio communications with incoming and outgoing aircraft, handing aircraft off from one airspace to the adjacent airspace. And so he had a lot of responsibilities outdoors. And when the AEC, the Atomic Energy Commission, told the CAA at the time that it was okay to go out and do runway maintenance, be outdoors and work, then Bob was required to continue on just as if nothing was going on. So as you know, the atmospheric testing got going about 50-51 right in there. And Cedar City, if you look at a map, is roughly about 100 miles downrange from the test site. And that's where you're going to get huge quantities of fallout being dropped out of the atmosphere, is about that far away. So there's Bob out there working in the stuff, and I'm absolutely certain that he got probably one of the most severe doses of anybody from the fallout. He was at the right distance. He was required to work outdoors. No regard for dosimetry to find out what was going on. Just out working in it. Now, do you want me to continue Bob's story?
You could talk a little bit about it. We talked to, I think, about with your mom, but maybe you could just go ahead a little bit more about what happened to him.
Well, he was transferred from Cedar City to Denver. The reason he was drawn to Denver was because that's where his mom lived, his sister. His mom was Letha Hacker. His sister was Wanda Hacker. Geez, I can't remember when his mom was born, but it must have been roughly around 1892. Just that would have made her 24 years old when he was born. So roughly around 1892, and his sister was born after he was. He was born 1916, so she must have been born right around 1920, plus or minus a few years. Letha Hacker's uncle, Benjamin Vernon, had moved to Rocky Ford, Colorado, and had been there for I don't know how long. But she decided to pick up and move from Indiana, Bloomington, Indiana, to Colorado. And so Bob had this tie with his mother living there, his granduncle living there, Benjamin Vernon, and his sister, Wanda, living there. So anyway, he got transferred back to got transferred to Denver at that point. Now, interesting point, and I have to mention this, is that Bob's mother, Letha, in the period after the war, so I'm going to say roughly, 1950 to 1956, she worked for Westinghouse Corporation in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And, oh, by the way, that's mentioned in one of the newspaper articles in Cedar City, is that he was taking a vacation. He would be visiting Denver and Albuquerque and one other location. His mother worked for Westinghouse, who was the primary contractor at Sandia National Labs. And Sandia had responsibility for assembling the bomb triggers. So she was there assembling bomb triggers at the very same time for the very same bombs that they were using to test in Nevada. Anyway, he got transferred in 1956 to the control tower at Stapleton International. That's the old airport, not the new one. And actually got involved in developing the technique of layering airplanes are in and around an airport airspace to bring them down in for landing. And as you saw in the newspaper article from the Denver Post, he received awards from the FAA, and that article was published May 2nd, 1968, and so that had to have been the end of April. It was a picture taken in Washington, D.C., and you can see he looks healthy in that photograph. But Bob developed cancer, and it started becoming evident in the summer of 1968. And so he called my dad and said, here's what's happening to me. He says, I've moved out of my house. I've left it to my wife. He said, I'm in an apartment right now. And he said the reason is he can't work anymore. And he wants people to remember him the way he was. My dad's going, what are you talking about? He says, I'm going to be there. So my dad took a trip to Denver and went to Bob's location and knocked on the door, and Bob wouldn't answer the door. So what ends up happening is he's talking through the window, through the curtains, so my dad can't see him. And what it is not only did Bob develop an internal cancer, but he developed a skin cancer that formed grape clusters all over his face and all over his body. He wouldn't let my dad in. He wouldn't do anything other than, just communicate with him through the window. And so my dad returned home. Bob ended up dying on September 27th, 1968. And his mom, Letha, authorized a postmortem. They went in and they looked at what happened to him and what the treatments did to him. Were they accurate in diagnosing that he had cancer? The doctor wrote in a letter shortly after. I think it was the autopsy was performed the day Bob died, September 27th, and the letter was dictated October 3rd, I think it was. And the dates, if you look at the bottom of the letter. And in that letter, the doctor says that what had happened was he had reticulum cell sarcoma, which is sarcoma, first of all, is a rare cancer. Most cancers are carcinomas, and it has to do with where the cells are forming and what the cells are formed out of. Sarcoma is of the organ tissue, or the muscle tissue, or the bone tissue, whereas cancers or carcinomas are formed on surface cells. So they don't really go into the organ or the organic structure. Sarcoma, or rather reticulum cell sarcoma, reticulum cell means that the cancer forms a network throughout, and in Bob's case, all of his vital organs. So that I kind of have this image of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. I don't know if you know that movie, but basically the reticulum cell sarcoma literally took over all of his body. And in the letter from the doctor that did the postmortem, it says it was extensive in all of his vital organs. So that would include his heart, his lungs, his liver, and it specifically mentioned his lymph system. So, and the interesting thing was there was that article published May 2nd in the Denver Post, but 4 months later, Bob's dead. That shows you how fast the stuff moved.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you would like to talk about in regards to the downwinders or nuclear weapons testing? So just sort of your personal thoughts about nuclear weapons testing, or personal thoughts about individuals impacted by it?
Yeah. Well, there's more of my experience with providing technical assistance or technical consulting to the air monitoring network. And of course, that was done during the era from 1980. I was involved 1981 to 1991. The program ended in 1993. That was for underground testing. And of course, they had some leaks on some of those underground tests. I ran the station here in Salt Lake for that period and provided technical support for the entire network. There were stations. There was a station in Cedar City and a station in St. George. And then there were about 4 stations in California, and the rest of them were in Nevada. I don't think there was one in Arizona. I don't remember speaking to anyone from Arizona. But, I talked to all those people that were running those stations in providing technical assistance. We had to train them on not only the radiation effects and where it came from and what it does to you, just exactly what is radioactive material. But we had to train them how to operate the stations. So, it was very involved in monitoring the materials that came out from 81 to 91, and that program ending in 93.
Can you talk a little bit about that? What did a day look like when you were your responsibilities in the monitoring process? What type of equipment did you use?
The station. There's still remnants of the station kept in a standby state. It's west of Merrill Engineering Building on the south west corner. By the way, that's where the reactor is too. So it was just right outside the door. And what it involved, there were several isotopes they would collect, but they would also monitor background radiation in a pressurized ion chamber. The reason it's pressurized, it's more sensitive than an atmospheric ion chamber. And in that, you're just looking for ionizing radiations that can penetrate the shell of the pressure container. So you're basically limited to gamma radiation. And with that, we could see increases in the background radiation by about 2 or 3 times background when a storm passed over. So that's how sensitive the equipment was. And of course, what happens when a storm passes over is low pressure moves in, the clouds move in, starts to rain. But as the pressure decreases, it brings the radon gases out of the rocks. And percolates up through and rests at it layers because it's heavier than air, and layers on the surface. So you can pick up the background radiation from radon on the pressurized ion chamber. By the way, I talked on Civic Dialogue with Chuck Mays from the radiobiology department right after Chernobyl, and that was one of the topics of discussion: is what is background radiation, and do we expect to see increases from the Chernobyl cloud as it circles the Earth? Did we see anything? Well, it's kind of hard to tell when you got background that's increasing 2 to 3 times regular background with just normal storms that pass through. I don't recall specifically seeing a bump from Chernobyl. So it would have probably been on the back of a normal low pressure bump in the pressurized ion chamber. We also collected with desiccant water vapors. They would pull through air, and any of the water vapor there would collect on the desiccant. They would take the desiccant in Las Vegas. We'd send it down to Las Vegas at the DOE lab down there. They would take it and heat it and drive off the vapor, the water, and then they would look for tritium in the water vapors. See, tritium, pressurized ion chamber. What else did they? Oh, we had a particulate monitor, like any particulate monitor for the EPA that they continue to run here in Salt Lake, looking at air quality. We had one of those with a glass filter and a charcoal filter on it. They would take those and analyze those for any materials coming out of the air.
So you talked about the bump.
Background bump.
Background bump.
Yeah.
During the testing where you were helping monitor,
Yeah.
did you see, were there any background bumps in St. George or the Cedar City area?
Well, this is from low pressures, from naturally occurring weather systems. Yeah, they would see them everywhere. So it was nothing out of the ordinary that didn't happen here 500 years ago. So same basic process. The real question you want to get to: did you see any evidence of the weapons testing, underground weapons testing? No, we didn't. And they would notify us. They would send out notices that we would have to post on each station, declaring that there was going to be a test performed on such and such a day. And what that would do is just kind of put on our radar, so we'd go out and look to see if we could see anything. Of course, that's just preliminary looks. And I think that would be kind of a safeguard if there was a leak. Because they'll tell you, some of that underground testing, some of that stuff did leak out of the ground, and it was detected. And they wanted to make sure that if it happened again, that they'd have a first warning of people on this air monitoring network around the test site. They'd have a first warning that there was a problem, and how much the problem was. And of course, downstream they were looking at lawsuits. And I don't know. I didn't look up the court records, the federal court records, to see how many lawsuits were filed and if they were successful and how much they were for and that kind of thing. But as you know, Wayne Owens started submitting bills in Congress. Wayne Owens being the 2nd District representative in the late 70s, early 80s, for radiation exposure compensation. And it wasn't until 1990, and I might be wrong in this, but I think it was Senator Orrin Hatch that was involved in submitting that version of it to the Senate, and that would have been 1989 to push it through. It was finally passed and signed into law by George Bush, first George Bush, senior, Grandpa Bush as we call him, and that went into effect. And have you looked at the bill to see what it allows?
Yeah. I know what cancers it allows, but I haven't read the bill in detail.
It is a pittance. It's like, and there are 3 degrees of compensation, and I think the lowest is 50,000, and the medium is 75,000, something like that. I looked at it, and I looked at the application to see if any of Bob's descendants could apply for this or did apply for it, and then to see how much it was. They only compensate children and grandchildren, no further than that. And Bob would have been qualified for a $75,000 compensation. That's a pittance. Yeah, ridiculous.
It is.
And of course, there was, along with that Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, involved in that were uranium miners and ranchers. I think there was a case of sheep around Cedar City that were wiped out. And that reminds me of the sheep that were wiped out in Skull Valley with the nerve gas testing out there. And that was, I remember I wrote articles on that to the Tribune. So And I was a kid at that point, and that was nerve gas, a little bit different.
The sheep farmer that you mentioned, we actually interviewed his daughter, and we have all of his papers now in our archive.
Oh, good.
Yeah. All of the stuff that his communications with Washington, and then the replies back from the federal government, basically saying it doesn't, you know.
It never happened. It doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't.
Yeah.
There's no effect.
Yeah.
Yes. Of course, they changed their tune on that. And I've been involved in situations with the NRC at these reactors, and nothing at the U of U, but you know, I'll be specific, at Idaho State University. And keep in mind, I'm licensed on those reactors, and with a license, you become the expert. And I was supervisor, so I was the senior expert at each location. And I'll tell you, the NRC, even today, and this is 2017, even today, really doesn't care. They just don't care. But I will say this, at Texas A&M when I was there, we had to self-report an exposure down there. And it was one of our senior researchers walking through a beam that was extracted off the core of the reactor, and he walked through it. It was not, there were no boundaries to the radiation area, to the beam. There was no controlled access, that kind of thing at the time. That was just before I arrived. So all of that stuff had been going on outside of my jurisdiction. But once, you know, I got in there and saw what was happening, you know, we had only one choice, and that was to self-report. Had they found out without us reporting, they would have hung us from the nearest oak tree, and that's no kidding. And even me, who was not even responsible for the procedures that were going on down with that experiment at the reactor. But nowadays, I have reported, and I did report, and I can show you the news release on that from the federal government, which was, because I was involved in the writing of the news release, I can tell you that's truthful. But when I reported the illegal distributions of controlled quantities of radioactive byproduct materials from the Idaho State University reactor, initially I got a lot of worried concern, and we're going to send a criminal investigator out there, and they did. A criminal investigator showed up to my home in Pocatello. I gave a deposition to officers of the federal court. By the way, the court reporter lived in Murray, Utah. And she came up to my house in Idaho, and we sat in my dining room area because, by the way, you know, there was fear that there would be retaliation, and there was later retaliation from the institution, and out of proportion retaliation for what was really done. But it kind of demonstrated a consciousness of guilt on the part of the institution and those people who were responsible for the operation of the reactor and the illegal distribution of the materials. But now let me finish the story. Is that after I gave the deposition, the engineer went in and he cited them for undocumented transfers, and that was it. They just had an administrative citation of undocumented transfers. This appears in the 93-1 Notice of Violation to the Idaho State University reactor license. And there was nothing further beyond that. Undocumented transfers. So they don't know what isotopes it was. They don't know who received them. They don't know if there was a license or not. They don't even know the quantities of materials. Nothing. They know absolutely nothing. And yet that's all they got was just a citation, an administrative citation.
And that was at the university,
Idaho State University in Pocatello. By the way, I still live there. And I have tried to intervene in the licensing up there, and they say, you don't live within 50 miles of the facility. I can tell you, my driver's license says I live 4 miles from the facility. That's the NRC. They don't care. Now, what ended up happening with that material, and I happen to have the inside track on this information because I was director of reactor operations here at the University of Utah. I was approached by people to do irradiations, produce byproduct material that they wanted transferred to them without a license, without a name, without documentation, for experimentation outside of the laboratory, not on the campus. And I assumed it was probably in some of those flatlands in northeast Tooele County, downwind of the lake. The reason being for that was that The winds come off of the lake very steady. They're uninterrupted by buildings or trees or mountains or hills. It's very flat out there, as you know. It's the border of the salt flats, but it's farmland. And I think what they wanted to do is aerosol tests with the radioactive materials. Now, I have just recently, I reported that in '93. That's why they sent the criminal investigator to my home to give a deposition, along with the court recorder. But all they did at that point was slap them on the hands. So now I'm thinking they're covering up for the licensee. And they don't know what this material was or where it went or what it was used for. Now, if you know anything about what's going on here in the state of Utah, geez, from the 1960s at least, there's what's in Tooele County, there's what's called the Utah Biological Test Laboratory, UBTL. And we had some interaction with them at the reactor lab here at the U during the 1980s when I was director there. It was nothing dealing with this, but what this ended up being, and I kind of pieced it together, it's in the interval since then, that was what, this is 17, it was 93, so we're looking at 24 years ago. What that material was, what they wanted it for, they wanted us to produce what are called radiobiotracers. So they're byproduct material that's attached to a molecule that is absorbed by organic structures, and they use it for various things. They can measure biological processes with it, but I think what this was used for is I think it was attached to an anthrax spore, and I think what they were doing was aerosol tests, not for anything extraordinary, no big scientific breakthroughs here. I think what they were doing was tweaking their spore production process by looking at things like different concentrations of agar solutions, which is a nutrient for the growth of spores, looking at pressures, temperatures, oxygen in environment, and what they would do is attach the radiobiotracer to the spore, and then they would measure the aerosolability, or how well this stuff traveled in the air. And so they would attach the radiobiotracers to the spores, put them into the air, and then downwind they would take radiation monitors and measure the quantity of spores that they could pick up. So it would pick up the concentration of the spores, and then they could figure out how effective their reproduction process was. Now, they did that in Pocatello. Now, it's interesting. Pocatello is just 170 miles up I-15, really quick. I mean, if you can't get the work done at the University of Utah and you're working spores in Tooele County, go to the next place. So they went to the next place. They got a hold of Albert Wilson, who was the licensed senior reactor operator there and the reactor supervisor. And the administrator was Harry Chariulu, Dean of the College of Engineering and the reactor administrator. These people were so incredibly stupid. Neither one of them had nuclear engineering degrees. Neither one of them had radiation protection training. And their facility documentation was so archaic. It was out of 1946. I swear to you, they had no documentation as to what was going on in that reactor. So they found the perfect dupes to have produce the radiobiotracers for them. Then they could go out into the fields south of town. And by the way, my home is south of town. So I saw them. This is how I put it together. I saw them going to and from work in the morning and in the evening, out in the field. How did I know? Because when I first became reactor supervisor there, I looked at what was going on. I looked at the records and I looked at what I was doing, and I'm going, there's no documentation of what's going on here. I can't do this. And I became very concerned and contacted the NRC at that point and said, we have problems here. And oh, by the way, it's in a recorded conversation I had with the NRC project manager in Washington, D.C., and the chief of reactor inspections out of Region 4 in Arlington, Texas. And it was recorded. They got approval for me to do that. And I told them that we have some very serious problems going out here. The response back, just to let you know, that they knew, they said, yes, we understand there are very serious problems there. Their response a few months later was to send a criminal investigator out. His name was Jonathan Armenta from Region 4. And all they did was slap him on the hand. They didn't bother tracking the material by documentation. They didn't bother looking at any of the financial records to see who was paying for this. They just blew it off. They cited them administratively and didn't bother bringing them into full compliance. Let me tell you, I interacted with them and said, well, shouldn't you have to require them to come into full compliance, to do their best to document where all of these materials went the previous 22 years? I didn't get to ask them that question, but I just said, I don't accept this as compliance. All they did, and they came back to me and said, well, they've changed their procedures. They now document the materials that they transfer. Well, that doesn't bring them into full compliance. That brings them into compliance from that point on. They still have all the previous 22 years to document and find out where this stuff was. Because the reality is, anyone who was affected by that material downstream, in the 22 years that those materials were not documented, can still sue the licensee. And, by the way, sue the NRC for not regulating them. And they didn't. They don't know where that material went. Now, I've written articles in the Salt Lake Tribune, one in actually the opening week of the Olympics in 2002, on this very topic. The response we get back from the reactor administrator, and guess what? He uses that as his qualifications. He's not licensed, so technically by the engineer's code of ethics, it's unethical for him to comment. That's why you never get a comment from the reactor administrator here at the U or any other competent reactor administration and management. Nobody ever does that. But Idaho State University, the reactor administrator comes out and makes the announcement, none of those transfers were illegal, and we know where all the material went. Well, that was a bald-faced public lie, number one. Number two, it was unethical for him to comment. By the way, his name's Jay Coons, and he's from Pennsylvania. He thinks he's an expert because he was head of the nuclear engineering program at University of Missouri-Rolla during the 1980s and 90s. He was not at Idaho State University in that period. He had no idea what went on in that period. He had no idea of the materials that were transferred, yet he's making public statements on something that he did not witness and had no access to the documents.
I'll have to look it up. See, the article was published in the SL Trib.
You looked it up? Yeah.
No, I will. I'll look it up.
My article was published now. These dates are plus minus a couple of days.
Okay.
But I think the opening Sunday of the Olympics was February 8th, 2002. And his response, mine was an op-ed. His response, and by the way, it was on how there are some of these non-power reactor licensees that illegally distribute, and nobody controls the stuff. And you know, it's like, well, geez, how many pharmacies, medical drugs, how many pharmacies around the country do we have? And they have to keep track of all the materials, and they do a relatively good job. And manufacturers, too, drug manufacturers. A huge network of pharmaceutical distribution. And they comply a lot better than Idaho State University, who had no idea where the material was going. And, oh yeah, it was used in a terrorist act, and I'll describe that in a minute. But Jay Coons, the reactor administrator, wrote his response in a letter to the editor that appeared a week later, the Sunday following, which 7 and 8, that's February 15th, 2002, and where he says, oh, there was nothing going on here, blah, blah, blah. As if he's being condescending to me. I am the senior licensed PhD on site. I see this going on. I report it. The NRC sends out a criminal investigator, and he has the gall to mention unethically that, oh, no, that didn't happen. He's not a witness. He's just making a statement off the cuff. Completely irresponsible. Now, that's my business. Give you an idea. That's why I told the story. Give you an idea of the NRC mentality, how they regulate materials, and the nuclear profession and what they think of controlling these materials. Some of them, now I will say, some of them are very competent. That's who I learned from, very competent people. And I get out into the boondocks, the wilds, places like Idaho State University, where there's very little interaction with the professional community, and they really don't care. They're retreads, what we call. They've been academically trained in another field, and they see money in the nuclear field, so they're attracted to it. And suddenly they become the nuclear experts. They are not nuclear experts. Jay Coons is not a nuclear expert. By the way, he's LDS. So he's up there giving this pious image, oh, I'm LDS, oh yeah, we comply with the laws, blah, blah, blah. Bull. He's the furthest thing from LDS. He doesn't care one iota what happened to that material and what it was used for. Now, Utah Biological Test Laboratory, that's where one of the vials that was maintained, that came from the specific vial out of the laboratory in Maryland of the exact genetic DNA fingerprint of the anthrax that was used in the anthrax attacks in October 2002. So there I am in the middle of all of this, and I've reported to the NRC in 1993. They did nothing except administratively cite them. So, as far as that goes, it's documentation that far. But what it was used for, they don't know. So I've reported this back to the NRC Inspector General and the FBI. The FBI had an investigation going on since the October 2002 anthrax attacks of called the Amerithrax investigation. There were 5 people killed. I think 2 or 3 or 4 of them were out of senators' offices, Senator Daschle, and I can't remember the name of the other one, but senators from other states. Back in Washington, D.C., there was a postal worker killed. Was he in New Jersey? I can't remember. Anyway, the stuff was mailed, and so the anthrax got out through that way. And I think there was somebody in Florida that was killed by way of postal contamination. They tracked it to that single vial, and that single vial had daughter vials that were kept at a couple of other labs, and one of them was UBTL in Tooele. So I've reported this, I've done my fiduciary duty. What more can I do? Well, I come back in 2009. I said, not only didn't you do your job right in 1993, but guess what? You missed a whole bunch of other violations, safety violations. And so they came out, they went to Pocatello and they investigated that. And they came back and said, oh, everything's in compliance. Well, I didn't look at that report. They didn't work with me during that period like they didn't work with me in 1993. They still didn't work with me in 2010. And they came back and said, everything's in compliance. And I didn't see that report until about 6 months ago. And I'm looking at this and going, this is the biggest crock I've seen. Because not only was I not reporting on the current configuration and operations at Idaho State in 2010, I was reporting what I saw in 1993. So they came back. My response to the Inspector General was, this is a useless report. I said, they didn't even bother to self-assess their performance. And as is written into the regulations, 10 CFR regulations for the DOE, self-assessment is one of the vital components of running a quality assurance program in an overall regulatory program. And they still, in 2017, don't bother to self-assess whether they're doing their job properly. They think they know it all. So who are these people? They're bachelor's degrees from other disciplines who get jobs working at the NRC. They don't know a whole heck of a lot about radiation protection and radiation control and for that matter, core physics. That's the furthest thing from their minds. They know absolutely nothing about it. The fission process, they know a little bit about it. They know a neutron strikes a uranium atom and causes it to split, and there are stuff that's produced afterwards, and it's radioactive. That's as far as they go in their minds. So, I put this back on them and said, you didn't self-assess, you didn't talk to me. I said, but the one thing that's obvious from the 2010 report is that in 1993, they blew off all these violations and gave the licensee at Idaho State University the opportunity to get back in compliance so they wouldn't be the bad guys, the incompetent guys. That's what the NRC did. That's what they're doing. They run interference for licensees so they can get away with their criminal activities, and they're not called on the carpet, it's not corrected. They keep it out of the public eye so that it looks like everything in the nuclear business is all fine and dandy. We're protecting public safety, public health, blah, 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 national security. And I know from eyewitness that even today, 2017, the NRC has incompetent people and they don't care. And this is after the atmospheric testing. What does it take?
Yeah, so that's one of our big concerns with the the gathering of these stories now. It's really relevant because there's this underlying conversation going on about our aging nuclear arsenal.
Yeah.
And I think maybe you mentioned, but several other people have mentioned it who have been direct working relationship with Atomic Energy Commission or the NRC, that there's really no way to model this, that they would have to do testing.
Well, of course they want to do testing, and the testing is as a quality assurance on the inventory. And what they have done, because there's such extreme public pressure to stop testing, they did stop it, and in 1993. And the only reason, by the way, that they agreed, I don't know if you know this, the only reason they agreed is because they knew what they could do is model everything with computers. And that's what they do right now to do quality assurance on the weapons inventory, is they model the decay and deterioration of the materials. I think they still want to do tests. I don't know if you remember recently, was this about 10, 15 years ago, an operation that the DOE wanted to conduct in Nevada called, what was it, Operation Strake or something Strake, S-T-R-A-K-E. And what they were going to do there was take 1,000 tons, I guess 1,000 tons of TNT and explode it. And then look at the ground vibrations, look at the atmospheric vibrations and what have you. The concern was that the oxidation products of the detonation would be spread into the atmosphere and they would be carcinogenic. And interesting enough, I was kind of involved on the outskirts of that. And the people they sent for the public hearings in the towns in Nevada, and I think there were some in Utah, they were so totally incompetent and arrogant. I don't know if did you attend any of the hearings on the proposed commercial fuel storage at the Goshute Indian Reservation?
No.
I went to one of those, and I looked at these 3 NRC guys, and they set up on this desk. And they sat there with their noses in the air, and they weren't going to respond to anything. It was like we're royalty, and we're not going to dirty ourselves by interacting with you dirty masses. And that's the impression I got from those people. That's the federal government attitude towards the public. We're not going to be held responsible for anything. We're going to do what we want to do. Why? Because we know it all.
Right.
They think they know it all. I get into the business, and I'll tell you, as a nuclear engineer, get into the business, and there are people who will they give off the air of being the unchallengeable experts, and I start talking to them, and I'm shocked at their ignorance. Shocked. These people don't know a whole heck of a lot about what it is they're doing. Now, I got the job at A&M, and I have to tell you this little story. Not only because there was a PhD candidate, and I was giving talks to rooms full of PhDs who operated these reactors. And it was the 1984 TRIGA Owner-Users Conference in Anaheim, California. I remember specifically because I was talking about digital control of nuclear reactors. And the NRC, they're standing up in the back, and the enthusiastic people are in the front, and this was the leading edge technology at the time. So General Atomic Representative Bill Whittemore was there. Art Johnson from Oregon State was there, and Don Feltz from Texas A&M. They were right on the front row. So I'm up there giving this talk, and the NRC, after I get it, it's comment question time afterwards. The NRC's in the back, and they start their sniping and their ignorant comments from the back. And there I am, a kid, and I'll tell you, I looked like a kid, and I felt like a kid in front of all these PhDs. And even though I was a PhD candidate and a director of operations, reactor operations here at the U, I fired back at them with the truth. And you should have seen the front row react. I mean, they just lit up. So I get job interviews at all these places, and I finally accepted at A&M. So I go down to A&M for the job interview. And, there I am, essentially strolling around their large reactor facility with my hands in my pockets, kind of looking at things and assessing what's going on. And I go, Don, what's this? And he said, well, that's a new experiment. We're fabricating the irradiation facility for it. That large, 8-foot by 6-foot box sitting on this stand 4 feet off the ground, it's aluminum, anodized aluminum. He said, that's going to be filled with heavy water. And then those 3 holes down in there, that's where we're going to place the samples, and they're going to be rotated. And we'll set this into the core, or into the open pool at the bottom of the tank, and roll the reactor up to it and then operate it. And what we're going to put in the sample holders are high quality silicon wafers, the raw wafers. They're silicon about that big. They're just very, very thin strips. And he said, what we're doing here is we're doping these for some very high quality semiconductor electronics. And I said, well, that's all fine and dandy. I said, Don, what are you going to do when you roll that reactor up? You got this heavy water in this sealed tank, and you get radiative dissociation among the molecules in the heavy water, and you've got now suddenly deuterium gas, D2O, and oxygen gas forming at the top of this. It's going to pressurize it for one thing, and it'll crack your welds. And another thing is, oh, by the way, if you get a spark in there, it's going up in an explosion. And as we know from Fukushima, we saw that. By the way, I sat there watching CNN, watching Fukushima, and going, those are going to blow. Those are going to blow. I hope they opened the ventilation on them. I hope. And they blew, and I just sat there. I looked over at Joyce, and I said, there you go. That's your nuclear experts for you. Now, it's Japan, but those were GE reactors. Why didn't they build an automatic ventilation system in that? Even, at the very least, open the darn trap door on the roof and let the stuff out. They didn't. But anyway, here we are at A&M with a similar type situation. Deuterium, which is hydrogen gas, and oxygen forming at the top of this. They got welds cracking. They got the potential for explosion, and they're putting the reactor up next to this. I said, Don, you better get that fixed. He called over the senior technician there. He said, you got to put a vent on this right now. So I got the job down there, by the way, just offering that free advice as an observation. You got a dangerous situation here in your reactor pool. You better do something about it. And Don, and I dearly love the man. He's an old German that we used to kid him about. He'd always be exact. So for Christmas one year, he got a belt buckle with a level on it, because he'd stand back and look at stuff. That's not quite level. Anyway, German precision. Yeah. So we kidded him that way.
I think I can shut this off.
Okay. And I did that so that Craig could finish his PhD and move on. And what his PhD is developing a technique called fission track analysis with the reactor, the configuration in the reactor, to be able to determine, quickly, would change the configuration of the reactor to change the speed of the neutrons that impinged on the sample. And we would take advantages of the differences between the fission cross-section for plutonium and the fission cross-section for uranium. And with fission track analysis, you have your material you want to analyze that has the very, very, very low levels of concentrations of these fissionable isotopes, and you put next to it a Lexan plate, intimate contact, and then you press them together to put a little force on it to make sure that they're held tightly together. Put those in varying flux of speeds of neutrons, and then you look at the concentrations. Well, I'm jumping. The fissionable atoms will fission, and then they'll send products off in two different directions, 180 degrees, and one of them will go into the lexan, whether it's on an angle or direct, it doesn't matter, because what it does is it punches a hole through the carbon chains in the lexan, and we take the lexan, then put it into acid, and it etches out that hole and makes it a diamond shape. I don't know why exactly. I mean, carbon chains seem to me they're kind of worms. They're like worms, looking in a bowl of worms. But after you'd etch it, it would make a diamond-shaped track through the lexan, and you put it into a microscope with reticules on there with a specified magnification, and then you count the tracks, concentration of tracks. And then by varying the speeds of the neutrons, you'll get varying fission rates. For the uranium and the plutonium, the idea here is to be able to determine literally parts per billion concentrations of fissionable isotopes in these materials. So we take the sheet bones, smooth them down, put the lexan, irradiate them, count the fission tracks, and then determine the concentrations of the uranium and the concentration of the plutonium. And of course, the reason you develop that technique is because if you just plain do fission track analysis, yes, you'll find the fission tracks, but you won't know if those fission tracks are from uranium or from plutonium. And there was both in the fallout.
And these were sheep bones from
southern Utah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
They were the sheep bones.
From the farmers
Yes.
that lost during testing. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
And it was a program that was funded by, this research program was funded by the DOE. But, this is 1980s, and it's to the point where, Wayne Owens filed the first bill in 1979, and we're looking at right about that same time, just shortly after that, where the proposal was sent to the DOE, and it was funded to do the fission track analysis on the sheep bones. By the way, that dissertation is here in this library.
Oh, it is?
Craig Jensen.
Craig Jensen, okay.
Yeah. Craig worked at University of Virginia as a professor in physics, I think it was.
Okay.
After he left here, he went to Oklahoma and then Virginia, and he must have worked there for at least 25, maybe 30 years. And he retired last year. He lives in Lehigh now. He's teaching at BYU.
Oh, okay.
Bad guy,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, thanks.